Hello my friends, hello my students. This is another episode of Foundations of Political Thought with John Phillips. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. And more specifically, we're going to talk about the structure of the argument that he makes to defend individual freedom, individual liberty. The structure of this argument is broadly consequentialist. We know that John Stuart Mill is a utilitarian, and so he's going to defend liberty. If he's going to defend liberty at all, it has to be on consequentialist grounds. So the question of the book, really, many questions addressed in the book, but the biggest question in the book is what defines the limits of the power which can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual. In other words, he's talking about the public-private line, right? The line that divides the affairs that are the individual's affairs to decide for themselves, and the line which separates that from what are society's affairs, right? What society can legitimately decide. Note that what this question is not about. This question is not about what it would be good for society to do. Strange for a utilitarian, I know, but bear with me for a moment. It's not about what it would be good for society to do, and it is not about what would be good for the individual to do. It's about the legitimate sphere of action of the individual and the legitimate sphere of action of society, understanding that sometimes individuals may presumably do things that are not good for themselves, and that sometimes society may have the right to do certain things, authority to do certain things that are perhaps not even good for society. Strange sort of view. So it's not quite the same as when would it be good for the government to intervene in an individual's life, and it's also different from the question when should government legislate, right? It's about when the government has authority to legislate. So there's one question about what defines the circumstances under which government has the authority to legislate. And then there's a further question, given that it has the authority, should the government actually do something? There may be times where the government has the authority to do something and simply chooses not to. That is to say, the right thing for it to do would be to do nothing, even though it could, if it wanted to. So the question Mill is asking, once again, concerns the line between public and private, and how to draw that line in a sensible way. How do we answer that specific question, as distinct from these other questions? Now, John Stuart Mill comes up with something he calls the harm principle. As a direct quote from Chapter 1 of On Liberty, the only purpose for which government can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant. Now, this is the conclusion of an argument. It's not an argument at all, right? It's a principle. It's a principle that needs to be defended, and that John Stuart Mill spends a good part of his book On Liberty trying to defend. Note there's plenty of interesting details, right? A member of a civilized community. Does that mean that if the community is not civilized, that the harm principle doesn't apply? Hard to know. And what is harm anyway? Well, that's a big kettle of fish, right? What counts as harm? Are all hurts harms? Are offenses harms? Right? These are questions that Mill is going to have to address in order to give some content to this principle. But the harm principle, like I said, is the conclusion of an argument about the value of individual freedom, about the problems, or what we may call the disvalue of coercion, and the broad conditions necessary for human progress. Under what sorts of conditions do human beings progress, become better, happier? Well, Mill thinks it's a condition under which the harm principle applies. So let's go through these three arguments one by one. First, the value of freedom. Why is freedom valuable? Right? Let's define freedom in a totally neutral but uninteresting way. The freedom from X to do Y. For those of you who've studied the distinction between positive and negative liberty, this will be a familiar sort of definition. Now, for Mill, freedom is instrumentally valuable to achieving the goal of subjective happiness. What is instrumental here? Well, instrumental here means that individual freedom acquires its value because it's a vehicle, an instrument, or a tool to achieve a desired end or goal. Right? And happiness, of course, as a utilitarian, Mill has to define happiness mostly subjectively. Whatever makes an individual happy. But note, he's not necessarily saying whatever an individual believes will make them happy. We might be wrong in all sorts of ways about what makes us happy. That's why, to some degree, we need freedom to discover happiness. We'll talk about that later. But happiness is, in some sense, objective, right? In some sense, there is a truth about what will make you feel good or feel happy. Assuming happiness is associated with a feeling, that's a whole different kettle of fish, but as a utilitarian, it has to have something to do with how you feel. But there's a truth about how you will feel, right? Now, there's also a fact about what you believe about how you will feel, but your beliefs, again, here are not at issue. The question is what will actually make you happy, right? And Mill says, look, we can show, presumably by providing evidence, that individual freedom is useful if you're going to have people who are happy. Why? Well, Mill builds on a couple of basic observations, right? Mill starts off with the premise that individuals are all different in what makes them happy. It would be a very simple matter if everybody got their happiness from the same sorts of things in life. But human beings are complicated creatures, and they're all very individuated, according to Mill, right? And what that means is that different things are going to make different people happy. And you might say, well, hold on a minute. Aren't most people ultimately the same? Don't we have the same cravings and urges? Ultimately, aren't we all, to some degree, human? I think Mill would probably acknowledge that. But a more subtle argument, and Mill doesn't make this argument, but I think one could certainly make this argument on behalf of Mill. One could say that individuals, we need to be made happy by different things to the extent that a lot of what makes us happy is what you would call rivalrous goods. That is to say that there's not enough to go around. And so things like status, right? There's just only so much status in the world, right? There's only so much status. So if we are all made happy by achieving the same social status, right? Let's say that there's only one dimension of competition that people care about, like baseball, right? Let's say that being good at baseball is the only thing that can give you social status in a human society. Well, then only a few people are ever going to be the best in any given period at baseball. Only a few people can get social status, and many people will have no social status because they lack the coordination and abilities to play baseball at a high level, right? But if there's many areas where we can get social status, if I don't have to be the best baseball player, but I can be the best skateboarder or crocheter or bass guitarist or kazoo player for that matter, right? If there's many bases for social status, then many more people can be happy, assuming that social status is one of the sources of self-respect that give people a certain amount of happiness. And so it's not only a fact for Mill that everybody's different, but it's also kind of a necessity, perhaps, that we all be made happy by different things. Okay, that was a bit of a digression, but again, Mill bases this idea on the fact that we're all different in what makes us happy. And a second premise in the argument is that becoming happy is an exercise in self-discovery. If I don't have the freedom to try out things that will make me happy, I don't know. We're not born with this information about what makes us happy downloaded into our brains, right? It's a process of discovery. We have to try different things. As children, we try different activities, different sports, different subject matters in school. Some of them we like, some of them we don't like, right? Trying to find out what makes us happy is an exercise in self-discovery. And if we don't have the freedom to try these things, right, freedom from interference, as well as some ability to try different things, then we're not going to be as happy as we can possibly be. And in some cases, we might not be happy at all. So to be happy, I have to find out what makes me happy. But I can only find that out through trial and error, Mill thinks. Pleasure and pain are creatures of the senses, and it's only through my senses that I can learn what brings me pleasure and pain, right? And I need the freedom to exercise my senses. So the liberty to pursue different experiments in living or different activities or different projects in life is the only way people will discover happiness. In other words, if I'm not free to choose my jobs or my hobbies or my spouse, these are freedoms that seem to be important to discover happiness, to discover what makes us happy. And if one choice doesn't work out, we need to be free to make other choices, right? Now note that what Mill's not saying here. Mill's saying that the liberty to pursue experiment seems to be a genuine precondition to experimentation and therefore happiness. But Mill doesn't say a whole lot about people who get in the way of their own happiness by refusing to experiment. We all know these people. Some of you may be a little bit like this, right? You don't like to try new things, right? You're conservative by nature in the sense that you're happy with what's familiar, not with new things. And it might be the case that what's familiar is actually a lot inferior to new things, but your own lack of desire to try new things may get in your way. Mill doesn't say very much about what to do about people who get in the way of their own happiness, right? Liberty seems to be necessary to happiness, but liberty by itself isn't going to make people want to try new things. And so in order to maximize happiness, we may need something more than freedom. But Mill doesn't say anything about that. Okay, so maybe I have to experiment to find out what makes me happy. Let's grant Mill this premise, right? But how do you know what to try? There are many lifestyles and experiments to try. You could spend a lifetime failing before hitting on something successful. Mill notes the only way human beings will progress in discovering what makes them happy is if they can learn from the successes and mistakes of others. And this is where it gets kind of interesting, because this is a case not just for you thinking that you should be free, but this is a case for letting other people be free, right? Other people need to be able to pursue experiments so that I may learn from them. In the same way that other people need to be free to pursue scientific experiments so I can learn more about the world, other people need to be free to pursue living experiments, to try new hobbies, to create new games and sports. If it's not about fun, then to attempt to start new businesses and professions and ways of earning a living, right? All of these things we need to be free to do, and other people need to be free to do, because we can learn from their successes as well as their failures. Okay. Argument number 2 from John Stuart Mill. The disvalue of coercion. Freedom is good, but Mill goes further and argues that coercion is also bad. Why is coercion so bad? What's wrong with preventing people from making silly or stupid or counterproductive choices? Well, Mill gives us 3 reasons why we should have a bias against coercion. It's not that we should never coerce. Mill is not an anarchist. He's a liberal, right? He's not an anarchist. He thinks that people can be restrained from harming one another and should be restrained from harming one another. But he also notes that coercion, at least on its face, has some bad aspects, right? All else being equal, we should try to avoid coercion. For one, coercion, forcing people to do things they don't want to do, is not a teacher, right? Coercion doesn't tell you why doing something's a bad idea. It just tells you that if you do it, you're going to be punished, right? So coercion is not a teacher. It doesn't teach you the reasons, and therefore it's not a long-term solution to getting people to behave well, because if people don't understand the reasons why they shouldn't behave a certain way, perhaps why they shouldn't do drugs or drink to excess, or whatever it might be, if people don't learn the reasons why, then they're just going to do it again when you're not watching, right? In other words, it's not a reliable way of getting people to not do something. The best way to get people to do the right thing is to teach them why. Teach them the difference between right and wrong, Mill says. Don't force them, because if you force them, odds are that won't tell them why, right? Okay. A second argument is that coercing entities, so whether those coercing entities might be parents, or they might be local governments, or they might be federal governments, or they might be specific entities like police officers, security guards, right? Coercing entities seldom have adequate information. So what that means is that they don't know your circumstances the way you do. In particular, they don't know what's in your heart and in your mind. They don't know your preferences, right? It might be bad for 99% of the population to do a certain thing, but it might be okay for you, right? You might be exceptional, right? It might be the case that most of the population is going to be harmed by doing a certain activity, perhaps a certain kind of drug. But it might not be the case for you. And so the coercing entity doesn't have adequate information about everybody. They have some information, general information perhaps, but they can't look inside your brain or inside your brain chemistry for that matter and know more than you or know better than you, right? Seldom have adequate information. They often don't have information about time and place. And third argument is that coercing entities seldom have adequate incentives. That is to say, they don't have your good in mind as much as you do. So if you do something that brings you pain or unhappiness, you have an excellent incentive to not do it again. But someone else may have other incentives in mind, right? They might want to sacrifice you for the greater good, for example, or they might not have your good in mind at all, right? So for that reason, coercing entities may sometimes coerce wrongly and badly simply because they don't have the same incentive to get it right as you do. After all, if the coercing entity gets it wrong, does anything bad happen to them? And this is often an incentive problem with government programs and public policies more generally, is that if the policy isn't working, do the people implementing it or the people legislating it get punished, right? And if not, then what's the incentive to get it right, right? If you don't have an incentive to get it right, then chances are you're not going to try as hard. And of course, individuals often have an incentive to get it right in their own cases. In cases where their behavior harms them, they have a real stake in getting it right. So from that perspective, coercion is not going to be efficient, right? Okay. So, good. I think we've already gone into this, so I'm going to skip through these slides since I've already tried to explain it. But it's worth noting that from the point of view of society, mistakes aren't necessarily bad, right? Mistakes are stepping stones on the path to success. In other words, a liberal society that Mill envisions is going to be one where people make a lot of mistakes. It's not going to be a perfect society where people always get it right all the time. It's going to be a society where people are constantly stumbling on the way to making progress, right? Understanding that for them, progress is an individual journey. It's not one that we can map out ahead of time by looking at the experiences of other people only, because other people are not like us. So coercion prevents progress. Insufficient information, inadequate incentives. Okay. Right. Sorry. Quick digression on democracy, right? We might come through an example like the following. If you had to pick a dinner item from 3 choices, pizza, salad, or roast chicken, which do you pick? And note, you can only have one for dinner. Well, no matter what the breakdown, right? If we make a collective decision, force people to abide by it, someone ends up eating something they don't prefer. That is to say, collective decisions always have what we call forced riders, right? People who have to do what the collective wants, even though they don't prefer it, right? Now, democracy is a pretty decent way of making that decision if it's the case that we all have to have one type of meal for dinner, right? If it's the case that we all have to live with a single choice, like a single national defense budget. Okay, fair enough. There's only got to be one, so some people are going to be disappointed. But in the case of things like what to have for dinner, it's not the case that we all have to have the same choice. We can all choose something different, and that doesn't impose any negative consequence on anyone else. So in areas, Mill reasons, where our choices do not substantially affect others, individually is far superior to democracy at producing maximum overall welfare. Some of us can have salad, some of us can have chicken, and some of us can have pizza, and everybody gets better off, right? Whereas the collective choice, where a choice is imposed from above, even democratically, is one where we're going to have a lot of forced riders, a lot of people who are consuming things that they'd prefer not to, even if perhaps the salad is better, right? Or the chicken is better than the pizza, right? It might be the case that the people make wrong choices. But again, how else are they going to learn? So, what are the limits to the harm principle, right? The conclusion that coercion is necessary when our actions harm others, but otherwise the costs of coercion outweigh the benefits, is basically the harm principle. Mill does make some exceptions, however. So what are some of these exceptions? Children. Children do not learn their own long-term interests. They don't know their long-term interests, particularly not much better than their parents. They're often not capable of being rationally persuaded. But of course, this case gets weaker as children get older. Other limits include the insane, again for the same reason. So those people who are out of their minds may not know their long-term interests. They may not be capable of being rationally persuaded. We have good reason to believe, especially that if they were in a different frame of mind, maybe they wouldn't make the same choices. So again, the insane, children, the harm principle does not apply to them. The harm principle only applies to kind of rational, mature adults. Of course, that leaves open the possibility of trying to find a way to define in a non-problematic way the line between childhood and adulthood and the line between sanity and insanity. But if we can come up with that line, then the harm principle is unproblematic. Mill also makes an exception for those living in societies where the available knowledge of information is such poor quality that many or most decisions will betray the interests of the decision makers. Now, one could look at this and just say, oh, well, it's a product of the times, right? Colonial, imperial England is thinking itself as being superior and more civilized than other people whom they don't really understand very well. And that might be true. And I think that's probably a fair way to interpret what Mill's talking about here, is that maybe he's just reflecting the prejudices of his own times by excluding what he calls primitive peoples, right? But if we wanted to take his argument seriously, one could certainly note that it might be the case that there are places, both within our society and other societies, where the available information and knowledge is really of poor quality, right? If everybody's acting on misinformation and disinformation, then it's impossible for those people to pursue their own interests effectively, right? Because they just don't have the right information. So if they have really weird ideas about what makes crops grow, and so are unable to feed themselves successfully, right? Or really weird ideas about anything, really, that ultimately make it impossible for them to pursue their own good. And it make it impossible for them, more importantly, and probably more importantly, not just impossible to pursue their own good, but impossible to update that information, right? If certain kinds of superstitions or prejudices are so deeply ingrained that it makes it impossible for someone to really change their mind, a kind of brainwashing, you might say, well, then it might be the case that the harm principle just won't work at making people happy. Freedom just won't work in cases where superstition or misinformation is too widespread, right? And that makes me think of our current times, especially our current times where certain corners of social media or certain corners of the internet seem to be living in that kind of bubble, right? A bubble of misinformation. And if that is the case, I say if that's the case, then one wonders to what degree Mill would have said his harm principle applies. Okay. These aren't, by the way, exceptions to the harm principle. They just simply indicate the limits of its applicability. And this is something that every principle has to have, as a limit to its own applicability. What it just means is that there are boundaries outside which principles don't apply, and that's probably true of any principle. Okay, the third argument, right? We said there were three arguments in favor of the harm principle. The third argument is to think about what broad conditions are necessary for human progress. Of course, that assumes that humanity can progress, right? But one can assume that material conditions get better and that people get somewhat happier with better material conditions as they take it out of poverty, starvation, poor medical care, poor health, right? Material conditions can get better. On the other hand, can the moral principles we live by get better? Can the percentage of people who are satisfied with their lives increase over time? Mill thinks yes. Mill thinks the answer is yes to all three of these questions. Mill really is trying to define, ultimately, conditions under which human happiness can grow over time. He notes that even if good rules of conduct were assigned to us, even if somebody could download them into our brains somehow, let us say rules of conduct and lifestyles and hobbies and interests and jobs that would in fact make us happy, the problem of uncertainty would remain, because we wouldn't really be justified in thinking that these were the right rules to live by until we had experimented with other ways. In other words, it's one thing to just happen to get things right, and it's another thing to know that you're going to get things right. So Mill's case here is what we call epistemic. It's not just that liberty gives us a better shot at being happy, it's that liberty will give us a better justification for thinking we are right in our judgments about what makes us happy. The more liberty, the more experiments people engage in, the more information we get, the more chances we get to try different things. All of that makes us more confident that ultimately we have found the best form of life for us. So it's possible that someone might, by happenstance, give us perfect rules of conduct, right? 10 commandments that, if we live by them, will make us happy. But Mill says, in order for us to be sure that those are the right 10 commandments, we still have to experiment, just in case we're wrong. So another way of putting the same point, and this is the way that Mill puts it, is that restrictions on liberty are assumptions of infallibility on the parts of government. Restrictions on liberty are assumptions that the government knows and you don't know what's right, what's good for you. They effectively say, we know the truth and you don't. But that assumption of infallibility is, well, first of all, very presumptuous. But second of all, the truth might change over time, right? What makes me happy today might not be what makes me happy tomorrow. So something might have been correct 30 years ago when the law was passed, but that doesn't mean it's correct today. And our inability to change, because we are coerced into some rule or other, our inability to affect change on our own means that progress is delayed, right, until legislation comes about. Right? In science, experiments are what helps us test and validate our theories. They help our knowledge progress. If we can't test a theory, then we have no reason for thinking it's true or false. Mill is really applying the scientific method here to political discussion and progress in opinion. He says, in fact, complete liberty of contradicting and disproving our opinion is the very condition which justifies us in assuming its truth for purposes of action. And on no other terms can a being with human faculties have any rational assurance of being right. So this idea of rational assurance of being right is the notion that we need to not just be right, but we need to have some degree of confidence that we're right in a world that's constantly changing, right? In a world that is moving forward in some sense. So Mill's case for experimentation is a kind of application of the scientific method to our own way of life. There's no opportunity for progress if discussion and experimentation are stifled, which is why freedom of speech and freedom of action, right, are not that different from Mill. Right? It's not like speech is one thing and action are another. After all, you could argue that a speech is a kind of act, and the Supreme Court of the United States certainly calls things speech acts, right, to understand that speaking is acting in a certain sense. Of course, for Mill, the question is to what degree your speech and your actions are harming others, right? And he thinks it's difficult. It's very rare for speech to harm others, right? He comes up with a couple different examples in his book of how speech could harm somebody else. Speech can hurt other people, right? Well, that distinction between hurts and harms might have to come some other time. Let's just think about some problems as we finish up, right? Some problems with Mill's argument. Harm is just a slippery category. Not all hurts are harms. We know that. Sometimes people can be subjected to unpleasant consequences that actually make them better off, that actually teach them something, right? So not all hurts are harms. And furthermore, not all harms are subjectively experienced. There are things that we can enjoy that are actually harmful for us, right? So some people who enjoy smoking, for example, or some people who enjoy certain kinds of recreational drugs or alcohol, or we can come up with any number of things, right, that may in fact harm us, but that we don't experience as harms. We experience them as pleasures at some level. So not everything that harms us feels bad, and not everything that feels bad actually harms us, right? There might be some things that actually are pretty good for us over the long term, especially. So for instance, burning yourself on a hot stove as a child hurts you, but as long as you heal from the burn, it might actually be a good thing long term that you understand that stovetops are hot. Maybe. 2, liberty is perhaps necessary for maximizing happiness, but it might not be sufficient. I think this is one of the things we discussed earlier, right? Okay, you have to have freedom to maximize happiness, but is that enough, right? Is it enough to have freedom? It might be necessary, for instance, to have a spirit of experimentation. You can give people who is completely uninterested in experimenting, giving them freedom is not going to give them extra happiness. They simply won't use that freedom. And of course, you might think about all the ways in which in liberal societies in the United States and Western Europe, in other parts of the world, where people have a lot of freedom and they use hardly any of it, right? Well, if that's the case, then it might be the case that liberty is just not enough. So I think one might ask Mill, okay, what more is necessary? 3, in matters of political opinion, the individual may have little interest in the truth, right? Mill's view, particularly about free speech, but also about experiments in living, is that we're just going to adopt the right answer as a matter of experimentation. But there may be issues about which we have little interest in finding out the truth, right? We want the answer that makes us feel good, not necessarily the answer that's the right one. Now, this might be subtle because, of course, in moral matters, Mill's a utilitarian, is to some extent committed to the idea that feeling good matters. But there might be cases in which we want to deceive ourselves. There might be cases where we encounter the truth and just ignore it because psychologically we have cognitive dissonance of some sort and just don't want to. So we have to be a little bit careful, particularly about this idea of the marketplace of ideas leading us ever closer to the truth, that there might be cases where we just have no incentive to know the truth. Okay, well, that was a somewhat long video, but I hope that it was informative. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch.